Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Tech Contracts Academy LinkedIn Live chat. Today's topic, cloud computing versus traditional IT contracts. Before we dive in, some quick housekeeping. We plan on going about 20 minutes. The recording will be available afterwards on LinkedIn. This conversation is for general educational purposes. While we are both attorneys, this is not legal advice, nor is it attorney advertising. We welcome your questions. Please submit them using the comments function. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce my colleague, David Tollen. David's the founder of Tech Contracts Academy and author of the Tech Contracts Handbook, a perennial ABA IP section bestseller. Hi, David.
Hello, Kathy, and hello, everyone. Very glad to be with you.
So let's start with some basics. Dave, what is the difference between a cloud services contract, cloud services like SaaS, and other IT business models like on-premise software and IT professional services?
Yeah, so fundamental question. And actually, I was just talking about this morning, and if any of you were with us on the World Contracts and Commerce Meet the Author discussion, you've heard some of this before, but there are really three separate business models that lie at the heart of information technology deals. Cloud services, on-premise software, and professional services about IT. And they're truly separate. And the first thing you need to do anytime you approach a contract is know which you're dealing with, or in some cases, it's more than one, because everything flows from there. And so the thing to understand is what we're looking at is different business models. You may get all sort of confused about terms like cloud computing. Cloud computing is actually an architecture. It's a way of organizing a system. And it's important to understand, but we're talking not about a technical term, but about a business model. The cloud services business model, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, involves the vendor hosting the technology. The customer never gets a copy of the software. It never gets its hands on the physical computers. It's all vendor hosted. And so that's categorically different from the more traditional software licensing model. It used to just be called software because it was the only way software was provided, but now we call it on-premise software. And that literally means the software is on the customer's premises. So the customer gets a copy of software provided by the vendor and runs it on its own computers. So those two are categorically different. And the difference, as I explain it here, it may sound simple, but it is so often misunderstood. And the different contract terms that flow out of it are often misunderstood. So that's the two first models: cloud services, tech hosted by the vendor, and on-premise software, tech given to the customer so that the customer can run it itself. And then professional services are also often confused with cloud services. And really the reason is the use of that word services in both. Professional services is simple if you think about it. It's just services by human beings. Legal services are professional services. Gardening services are professional services. It's just a human helping and being paid for it. And in the IT world, that's programming, tech support, implementation, customization. So those are services by humans. And the way to look at it is this deal about providing a human to assist in some other way? Or is this deal fundamentally about providing remote access to technology? And if it's the latter, it's cloud services. So don't get confused by the use of the term services. And also don't get confused that a cloud services vendor, obviously there's humans working there, and you might even be able to get those humans on the phone. It's not like it's human-free cloud services. The key to understanding it is that what you're buying is not the help of the people. You're buying the remote access to the technology in cloud services. Whereas in a programming deal or a a implementation deal or something like that, tech support, you're buying the help of the people, often on a time and materials basis. So you can't really do a good job with your contract unless at the very beginning of looking at it, you're clear on that distinction. Which of the three is it? Or there's some other random possible categories, but most of those three. Which is it? And is it more than one? And incidentally, this is the starting point of all my teaching. So if you've got my book, the Tech Contracts Handbook, the first thing it talks about is prime clauses. It's the main promise from the vendor. And there, the vendor promises either the license to on-premise software or the remote access to cloud service. So you start with that. And that is also, we're teaching these master classes you can see on the screen. And we begin there also in teaching how to do this. We always begin with what's the deal and what is the prime clause that launches it. And everything else sort of hangs off of that knowledge and that conclusion.
So let's explore this a bit with these different business models. What differences should we be looking for, specifically, say, for the intellectual property terms based on the business model that's involved?
Yeah, IP between the two is one of the things that is fundamentally different. Once you've figured out which you are, it should guide you on what your intellectual property terms are. So one of the most common mistakes I see in cloud services contracts is the grant of an intellectual property license. In other words, the vendor says, vendor hereby grants customer a license to the software as a service. This is on the assumption that there's some kind of intellectual property transfer from the vendor to the customer. And there isn't, or at least shouldn't be, at least if this is a pure cloud services deal, if there's no, say, downloaded software. So think about it. In an on-premise software deal, the customer receives a copy of the software from the vendor and needs to make more copies of it, put it on people's computers. The fundamental thing it's going to do is make copies. And so the prime clause, the number one grant from the vendor is an IP license. It's a copyright license that allows the customer to reproduce the software and maybe do other things. In software as a service, other cloud services, that never happens. You're not getting a copy, so you don't need to reproduce it. In fact, you can't reproduce it. You have nothing to reproduce. And that's fundamental. So if you're the vendor of cloud services, you really don't want to grant licenses. And you may have, I'm hoping I'm not giving anyone a heart attack. You may have done contracts that say, we hereby grant the customer a license to the software as a service or the platform as a service. It's probably not the end of the world. What you're hoping there is that if there's ever some kind of dispute, that the word license will be seen as sort of colloquial. It doesn't mean IP license, it just means permission. And license can be used that way. But you're better off not even creating that risk in your contracts. And there are some risks for the vendors. If you get into a dispute, if there's an implication that you've granted an IP license, you could get in a situation where you might have to even share a copy of your software. It's at least conceivable with the customer. Or looking at it as a license, as a copyright license, might trigger copyleft obligations under open source licenses. If you have some open source software, which you almost guaranteed do, included in your system. And there are other legal consequences that aren't likely, but could flow from that. And so what we teach in our master classes and other courses is just call it a subscription. It's not a magic word. Vendor hereby authorizes customer to access and use the software as a service during the subscription term. The word license never comes in there. And in fact, I go further and say this agreement does not grant customer any license to intellectual property, or at least does not grant customer any copyright license. There's a whole complicated question of whether there's an implied patent license. both in cloud services and on-premise, but let's not get into that complicated issue. So that's the IP difference between cloud services and on-premise. And then professional services are another thing. There's generally not an IP clause in a professional services contract, at least a grant of IP. All of these contracts could have things like IP warranties and indemnities, but there's not a grant of IP because the only grant is we're going to help you. We're going to, for time and materials, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. The professional services people might produce deliverables. They might be producing software, which might then need its own license clause. So I call that a combination contract. You've got professional services and on-premise software if the deliverables are on-premise software. So, but beyond that, it's a promise of people's help, not of a transfer of intellectual property.
So let's think about what other sorts of terms other than the license may be in, say, an on-premise or a professional services contract that don't belong in a cloud contract.
Yeah, so here's where it becomes so vital that you got it right from the start, because if you didn't get it right from the start, not only have you got the wrong prime clause, maybe a copyright license to your SaaS when you didn't want to get one, but all the stuff that sort of hangs down from it could be wrong too. So for instance, I've worked on deals for software as a service where the lawyer on the other side, says, where's my maintenance clause? Where are my updates and upgrades? And it's based on a misunderstanding. So that's an example of a set of terms that generally do not belong in a cloud services contract. In most cloud services, software as a service, et cetera, it's a public structure. So that what that means is the vendor is providing, look at it as one copy of the software that lots of people are accessing and using. And the number of copies is actually a complicated way to look at it, but it's one system and all of its customers are accessing and using it. In that context, it doesn't make sense to talk about a maintenance clause or to talk about updates and upgrades. The vendor's updating and upgrading it anyway. I mean, it's their software, they're running it. They don't need to come to you and say, we've got a new update and we're going to send it to you. It's a matter of course that they're doing it. And it's not, a maintenance clause is about the vendor basically coming to the customer's premises or logging in, to the customer's premises and fixing something. That again is not relevant to at least public software as a service, platform as a service. What you have really instead of the maintenance clause is the service level agreement. And that is the clause that talks about minimum standards of how the vendor is going to keep that technology up and running. So, so first answer is you don't have a maintenance clause in a cloud services contract. You instead, or at least you generally don't. The word maintenance can be used for any number of things, but a classic maintenance clause with updates and upgrades you don't have. You instead have a service level agreement. So another thing that that really differentiates the two, and this is less what you don't have than what you do, a cloud services contract should have a lot of terms about data. And data it's not of zero interest in the other two types of contracts, but it's a vastly different concern. And so you got to understand at a fundamental level, in cloud services, the technology is on the vendor's computers. As a result, the customer's data that the technology is manipulating is on the vendor's computers. And that's a whole other world from, say, on-premise software where the customer is running the software on its own computers, so it has the data. So all of the concerns that surround data appear there. And what customers should be looking for is a data management and security clause. This is a clause that addresses what the vendor can do with the data, what the vendor needs to do to protect the data. It will often get into the issue of compliance with privacy laws in order to keep the customer, as well as the vendor, but mostly to keep the customer out of trouble with its own customers or its employees or whoever's data it might hold. So there's a whole long set of issues that you need to address in cloud services contracts related to data. And by the way, if you want an example of that clause, or actually anything else I talk about, our website, techcontracts.com, has all of the sample clauses from my book for free. You can just go to the clause library and you can just copy and paste them. So you can see the whole long set of terms in a data clause. Incidentally, what my advice is, know what all the good terms are, look at what we've provided, this long list of terms. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get them from every vendor, but it helps you be aware of what you should be looking for. So then the flip side of the question is, where and to what extent should data terms appear in the other two types of contracts? In a professional services contract, unless there's some of the customer's data going onto vendor computers, for instance, to experiment with it or something, or unless the vendor has some kind of special access behind the firewall to the customer's data, you really don't need data management and security terms. So, generally what we see is where there is that sort of special access behind the firewall for the vendor, we have usually a more limited set of data terms. We are concerned about data. We're concerned that someone might be able to, for instance, hack into the vendor's systems and through that get into the customer's systems where the data is. So it's not a zero concern, but it's a whole other world than a deal where the data is literally on the vendor's computers. In on-premise software, you don't have data on the vendor's computers, and maintenance might lead to that same kind of professional services concern where people can get in behind the firewall and look at the data. But aside from maintenance, the data's on the customer's computers. You don't need a lot of terms about data, and so data is really the central issue that should separate the clauses as well as your thinking about how these contracts work.
So we have a few minutes left. We encourage your questions if anyone wants to put a question in the comments. And meanwhile, I guess I would ask Dave, you've addressed some errors that you tend to see in cloud computing contracts. Are there others that come to mind that you commonly see?
Yes. So lots of errors come up in addressing cloud services, and it's mostly because people are trained to think about on-premise software, and so they don't think about these separate issues, or that just the separate issues raise some entirely new issues that are sort of hard to get your head around. So one error that I see customers do, and this is back to data, is focus on ownership of data in their contracts instead of on control of data. So there's this widespread misunderstanding in the community that you can own knowledge or information. And people talk about intellectual property. They say our intellectual property. Often they're referring to their techniques and the other important stuff that their company knows. And actually, that's not intellectual property. You can't have IP rights in knowledge, except to the limited extent that you can in a trade secret. And what that means is just saying we own the data, if you're the customer, doesn't give you a lot of protection. It doesn't restrict the vendor from doing all kinds of things with the data that you might want, because intellectual property is sort of a weak vehicle when looking at data. And so the mistake is to just say that and think you've achieved something and not put a lot of attention into what I was just talking about, the data management and security clause. That clause addresses control of data. You sort of substitute for the weakness of intellectual property in governing data with actual contract terms. The vendor promises to do X, Y, and Z. So focusing on ownership instead of control is one of those common mistakes. And by the way, get ownership. Definitely say we own the data, and there's language at techcontracts.com that addresses that. But then focus on ownership. Another common mistake that I see is, again, related to data, is sort of going south, going wrong related to data indemnities. And often it's the customer feeling, if we can't get the data indemnity we want, we're going to walk away from the deal. Indemnities are a whole large, complicated subject. We spend in the masterclass series we've got running now, we spend, I think, 45 minutes on indemnities alone. And we have webinars on indemnities too. And so there's a lot of complexity there. The short message about indemnities is there's actually a lot of problems with data indemnities. Data indemnities create problems for the vendor that are very different from IP indemnities. And you shouldn't feel, if you can't get a data indemnity, that you shouldn't do this deal. You also shouldn't give up on what the data indemnity might include if you're running into obstacles. Sometimes a vendor will give a data indemnity, but subject to some limit of liability or some other restriction to avoid the costs. The message is data indemnities are harder for indemnitures, for the vendors, and create more risks. And so you're less likely to get them. Don't imagine that means you have no protection related to data. You just don't have that protection against third-party lawsuits from the vendor. You have, if they breach their data management and security terms, then you might have a claim. Finally, quick third typical mistake is customers not reading those service level agreements thoughtfully, carefully, understanding what is promised, what isn't, how limited definitions of things like uptime really are. Sometimes there's some hidden tricks in those definitions that can really get you into trouble, and you really got to pay attention.
Well, I know we could talk much longer on these topics, and you certainly do in your trainings, but we're about at time. So I think we'll call it for today. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much. And everybody, as Kathy mentioned, all of this stuff we talk about in our trainings. This month, November, we have the masterclass series going on. It's a series of 4 roughly 2-hour courses, and you get a certificate for each, or a total overall certificate for completing them. And then they start again in mid-January. And we also have webinars. So would love to see people at that. And also would love to see people the next time we do one of these short LinkedIn live talks. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. If you found this video useful, please come check out Tech Contracts Academy. We provide training on drafting and negotiating contracts about artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other forms of software. It's all for lawyers, contract managers, and any business people involved with contracts. So please come check out our programs live and on demand at techcontracts.com.